Hello everyone, it's midnight. You're alone in a medieval street. No lights, no help, just darkness and the feeling you're not alone. The curfew bell has rung, and if the guards catch you now, you may not make it back. But what's worse than the guards is what moves in the dark. Stay with me, because what really happened after dark is more terrifying than you think. Before you settle in, like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy these stories, and comment where you're watching from. When darkness fell in medieval times, the world did not simply become quieter. It became fundamentally more dangerous, more uncertain, and far less forgiving than anything we experience today. If you were caught outside after dark, your situation could quickly turn from inconvenient to life. Threatening, depending on where you were, who you were, and what time period you lived in. Streets in medieval towns were rarely lit in any meaningful way. At best, a few oil lamps might flicker near important buildings or along main roads. But most alleys and side streets were swallowed by complete darkness. Without modern sanitation, these streets were often filled with refuse, animal waste, and open drains, making even walking a hazardous task. One wrong step could lead to injury, illness, or worse. In many towns, curfews were strictly enforced, often signalled by a bell known as the curfew bell, which literally meant cover the fire, instructing people to extinguish hearth fires and retire indoors. After this bell rang, ordinary citizens were expected to remain inside their homes, unless they had a very good reason to be outside. Being found wandering after curfew could immediately arouse suspicion. Watchmen or guards patrolled the streets, and if they encountered you, they would likely stop and question you. You might be asked to identify yourself, explain your purpose, and prove that you had legitimate business. Failure to provide a convincing explanation could result in detention, fines, or even physical punishment, depending on the laws of the region and the temperament of the authorities. The fear was not just legal, it was also deeply social and psychological. Nighttime was associated with crime, disorder, and even supernatural danger. Thieves, cut purses, and violent gangs often used the cover of darkness to carry out their activities. Without effective policing systems, these individuals operated with relative freedom once the streets emptied. If you were alone, you were an easy target. There were no emergency services, no quick ways to call for help, and no guarantee that anyone would hear you if you shouted. In fact, many people would deliberately avoid getting involved, fearing for their own safety or suspecting that the situation itself might be suspicious. In rural areas, the dangers were different but equally severe. Travelling after dark through forests or open countryside meant risking encounters with wild animals, bandits, or simply getting lost. Roads were poorly maintained and often unmarked, and without artificial lighting, even familiar paths could become disorienting. Weather conditions could worsen the situation dramatically. A sudden fog, rainstorm, or drop in temperature could turn a simple journey into a deadly ordeal. Religious and cultural beliefs added another layer of fear. Many people in medieval societies genuinely believed that the night was a time when evil forces were more active. Stories of spirits, demons, witches, and other supernatural beings were widespread, and these beliefs influenced how people behaved. Being outside after dark was not just physically risky, it was spiritually unsettling. This fear was reinforced by the church, which often emphasized the dangers of moral and spiritual corruption associated with the night. Even if nothing supernatural occurred, the psychological stress of being alone in complete darkness, surrounded by unfamiliar sounds, could be overwhelming. For certain groups of people, the risks were even greater. Women, for example, faced heightened danger due to the lack of protection and the social expectations placed upon them. Being found outside at night could damage a woman's reputation, leading to suspicion of immoral behavior. Similarly, strangers or travelers were often viewed with distrust. If you were not recognized by the local community, you were more likely to be questioned, harassed, or even accused of wrongdoing. In some cases, you might be mistaken for a criminal simply because you were unfamiliar. Social status also played a role. Wealthier individuals might carry lanterns or be accompanied by servants, providing some level of safety and legitimacy, while poorer individuals had fewer resources and were more vulnerable. Punishments for violating curfew or engaging in suspicious activity varied widely. In some towns, you might be fined or temporarily jailed. In others, more severe measures could be taken, especially if you were suspected of a crime. Public punishment was not uncommon, and authorities often used it as a deterrent. Even if you were innocent, the burden of proof could fall on you, and legal systems were not always fair or consistent. The mere act of being outside at the wrong time could entangle you in a situation that was difficult to escape. Despite these dangers, there were legitimate reasons for people to be outside at night. Bakers, for instance, often worked during the night to prepare bread for the next day. Night watchmen themselves were obviously active, as were certain labourers and travellers who needed to move between locations. However, these individuals typically had some form of identification or explanation that justified their presence. Carrying a lantern was not just practical. It was also a signal that you had a purpose. Moving confidently and with clear intent could sometimes reduce suspicion. But it was never a guarantee of safety. The experience of being outside after dark in medieval times was therefore a complex mix of physical danger, legal risk, and cultural fear. It was not simply about the absence of light. It was about entering a different world altogether, one where the rules of daytime society no longer fully applied. The structures that provided safety and order during the day, community presence, visibility, and routine, were largely absent. In their place were uncertainty, vulnerability, and the constant possibility of encountering something or someone that could harm you. Survival depended on awareness, caution, and often a bit of luck. For most people, the safest choice was clear. Once the sun set and the curfew bell rang, it was best to stay indoors, secure your home, and wait for the return of daylight, when the world would once again feel predictable and manageable. As the night deepened in medieval times, the sense of vulnerability only intensified, because darkness was not just an absence of light, it was an absence of control. After curfew, towns effectively transformed into loosely guarded spaces where authority existed but could not fully see or manage what was happening. Even the watchmen who were tasked with maintaining order were limited by their numbers and by the very darkness they patrolled. Their calls echoed through the streets, announcing the hour, warning of fire, or simply signaling that someone was on duty. But those calls could not reach every hidden corner. If you were caught outside after dark, you were stepping into a world where visibility was low, trust was scarce, and suspicion was high. A watchman might approach you not as a citizen to be helped, but as a potential threat to be contained. You could be ordered to accompany them, questioned repeatedly, or even held overnight until your intentions were verified. In some places, failing to carry a light source like a lantern could itself be considered suspicious, because it implied you were trying to move unseen. The physical environment itself worked against you. Medieval architecture often featured narrow, winding streets with overhanging buildings that blocked what little moonlight might otherwise reach the ground. These cramped pathways created shadows that shifted unpredictably, making it difficult to judge distances or recognize faces. If someone approached you, you might not see them until they were only a few steps away. This made confrontations sudden and often unavoidable. If you encountered a group, your chances of escaping unharmed dropped significantly. Violence could erupt quickly and with no organized emergency response. Injuries that might be minor today could become fatal due to lack of immediate care. Even something as simple as tripping and falling could leave you stranded, unable to move, and at the mercy of the environment or anyone who came across you. There was also the ever-present risk of fire, which was one of the greatest dangers in medieval towns. Buildings were commonly made of wood, with thatched roofs and tightly packed layouts that allowed flames to spread rapidly. This is one of the reasons curfews existed in the first place, to reduce the likelihood of accidental fires caused by unattended hearths or candles. If you were outside at night and a fire broke out, you might find yourself in chaos almost instantly. Bells would ring, people would rush into the streets, and the orderly structure of the town would collapse into panic. In such moments, being outside could either be a stroke of luck or a fatal misfortune, depending on where you were and how quickly you could react. You might be pressed into helping fight the fire, whether you wanted to or not, or you might be accused of causing it if you were seen nearby without a clear explanation. For travelers, the situation was even more precarious. Inns and city gates often closed at night, meaning that if you arrived too late, you could be locked out entirely. Being stranded outside city walls was particularly dangerous, as you lost even the minimal protection that the town might offer. You would have to contend with the open countryside, where threats included not only human attackers, but also natural hazards. The absence of landmarks in the dark could easily lead to disorientation. Without a reliable sense of direction, you might wander further away from safety instead of toward it. The night air could grow cold, especially in certain seasons, and without proper shelter, hypothermia was a real risk. Yet even beyond the immediate physical and legal dangers, what made being outside after dark in medieval times truly unsettling was the complete shift in how reality itself seemed to behave. The night did not merely hide things, it altered perception. Shapes looked distorted, distances felt uncertain, and familiar places became unrecognizable. A road you had walked countless times during the day could feel like an entirely different path under the faint glow of moonlight. Landmarks disappeared into shadow, and without consistent visual references, your sense of direction could quickly unravel. People often relied on memory and instinct, but even those could fail under the pressure of darkness. This disorientation was not just inconvenient, it could be deadly. Taking a wrong turn might lead you into a dangerous part of town, toward a riverbank, or into an isolated area where help was unlikely to come. There was also a deep psychological weight attached to being alone at night. Silence in medieval settings was rarely complete, but it was filled with ambiguous sounds. The distant barking of dogs, the creaking of wooden structures, the rustling of wind through narrow alleys, or footsteps that might or might not belong to another person. Without the constant background noise of modern life, each sound stood out sharply, forcing your mind to interpret it, often in the most fearful way possible. The human imagination, especially in a time rich with superstition, could turn ordinary noises into signs of something far more sinister. This constant state of alertness drained both mental and physical energy, making it harder to think clearly or react effectively. Your own body could become a liability in such conditions. Fatigue, hunger, or illness would affect you more severely at night when resources and assistance were limited. If you were already weakened, the effort of navigating dark, uneven terrain could push you to your limits. Even carrying a lantern, while helpful, came with its own problems. It provided only a small circle of light, leaving everything beyond it in deeper shadow. It also made you visible from a distance, effectively announcing your presence to anyone nearby. In some cases, people would deliberately extinguish their light to avoid drawing attention, but doing so left them nearly blind. This constant trade-off between visibility and concealment added another layer of complexity to moving through the night. Encounters with others after dark were often tense and unpredictable. Without clear visibility, intentions were difficult to read. A simple meeting on a narrow path could quickly become a standoff, with both parties unsure whether the other posed a threat. Words exchanged in the dark carried more weight, and misunderstandings were more likely. A raised voice or sudden movement could escalate the situation, leading to conflict that might have been easily avoided during daylight. Trust, which was already limited in many medieval communities, became even more fragile under these conditions. For those who worked at night out of necessity, such as watchmen, bakers, or certain craftsmen, there was a level of familiarity with these risks, but that did not eliminate them. Instead, it created a different kind of awareness, a constant readiness to respond to danger. These individuals often developed routines and strategies to navigate the night more safely, such as sticking to known routes, coordinating with others, or using specific signals to identify themselves. Even so, they were not immune to the hazards. A watchman could still be attacked, a baker could still be accused of suspicious activity, and a labourer could still find themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time. Another overlooked aspect was the legal vulnerability tied to timing itself. In many cases, the burden of proof shifted more heavily onto the individual at night. If something went wrong, a theft, a fire, or an act of violence, anyone found nearby after dark could become an immediate suspect. The lack of witnesses and the difficulty of verifying alibis made it easier for accusations to stick. You might be forced to defend yourself not only against physical threats, but also against claims that you had done something wrong, simply because you were present. In a system where justice could be inconsistent and influenced by status or reputation, this was a serious risk. The natural environment also played a more active role after sunset. Changes in temperature could be abrupt, especially in regions with significant day, night variation, Dew could make surfaces slippery, increasing the chance of falls. Insects and nocturnal animals became more active, some of which could pose threats either directly or indirectly by spreading disease. Even the sky, while sometimes offering guidance through stars or moonlight, could also become an obstacle if clouds rolled in, plunging everything into deeper darkness. In such moments, the difference between knowing where you were and being completely lost could vanish almost instantly. Perhaps one of the most striking differences between medieval nights and our modern experience is the absence of any reliable safety net. Today, if something goes wrong, there are systems in place: emergency services, hospitals, communication networks that can be accessed relatively quickly. In medieval times, those systems either did not exist or were extremely limited. If you were injured, lost, or in danger, your options were few. You had to rely on your own abilities, the goodwill of others, or sheer luck. This lack of support amplified every risk, making even small problems potentially catastrophic. Over time, these realities shaped behavior and culture in profound ways. People learned to respect the night, not as a peaceful or romantic time, but as a period that demanded caution and restraint. Stories, rules, and traditions all reinforced the idea that once darkness fell, the safest place to be was indoors, surrounded by familiar people, and protected by whatever barriers you could secure. Doors were locked, windows were shuttered, and fires were carefully managed. The boundary between inside and outside became more than just physical. It was a line between relative safety and significant danger. So if you were caught outside after dark in medieval times, you were not just dealing with a single problem like being late or lost. You were stepping into a layered and unpredictable environment where every decision mattered and every moment carried risk. Whether it was the threat of being questioned by authorities, the possibility of encountering criminals, the challenge of navigating in near total darkness, or the psychological strain of isolation and uncertainty, the night demanded a level of awareness and resilience that few could sustain for long. It was a time when the ordinary rules of daily life no longer applied in the same way, and surviving until morning often depended on a combination of caution, experience, and fortune. And as the hours stretched deeper into the night, something even more unsettling took hold: the gradual erosion of certainty. In medieval times, people were deeply connected to the rhythm of daylight, and once that rhythm broke, so did their sense of control over time itself. Without clocks accessible to most people, the night blurred into an indistinct stretch where minutes and hours were hard to measure. You could not easily tell how long you had been walking, how much longer until dawn, or whether you were moving in the right direction at all. This loss of temporal awareness made every decision heavier, because you were acting without a clear sense of progress or end point. The longer you remained outside, the more fatigue and doubt crept in, slowing your reactions and clouding your judgment. In that state, even small challenges could spiral into serious threats. Hunger and thirst, which might be manageable during the day, became more pressing when you had no access to food, water, or shelter. Wells and communal resources were not always accessible at night, and approaching private property could be risky, as homeowners might react defensively to unexpected visitors after dark. You might hesitate to knock on a door, knowing that the person inside could interpret your presence as hostile. And if you did take that risk, There was no guarantee of help. Fear often outweighed generosity when visibility was low and trust was uncertain. There was also a strong element of social consequence, tied to being seen outside at the wrong time. Medieval communities were tightly knit, and reputation carried immense weight. If someone noticed you wandering after curfew, word could spread quickly, especially in smaller towns or villages. Questions would arise. Why were you outside? What were you doing? Were you involved in something improper or illegal? Even if you had a legitimate reason, the mere association with nighttime activity could cast a shadow over your character. This was particularly damaging in a society where social standing influenced everything from employment opportunities to personal relationships. A single incident could alter how others perceived you for a long time. For individuals already on the margins of society, such as the poor, the displaced, or those without strong community ties, the risks multiplied. These people were more likely to be outside out of necessity rather than choice. And they were also more likely to be targeted by both criminals and authorities. Without a stable home or recognizable status, they had little protection against accusations or mistreatment. If something went wrong, they had fewer allies to defend them and fewer resources to recover. The night, in this sense, amplified existing inequalities, making survival even more challenging for those who were already vulnerable. And if the night stretched on long enough, another subtle but dangerous shift began to take hold. The slow breakdown of confidence in your own decisions. In medieval times, people depended heavily on routine and familiarity to navigate daily life. But outside after dark, those anchors weakened. The longer you remained in that uncertain environment, the more second-guessing crept into your thoughts. Was that the right turn? Did you pass this alley already? Are those footsteps behind you, or just your imagination echoing off stone walls? This constant questioning could lead to hesitation, and hesitation in a risky environment often made things worse. You might pause too long in an exposed area, or choose a path out of fear rather than logic, leading yourself into deeper trouble. Your senses, already strained by darkness, could begin to mislead you. Shadows seemed to move even when nothing was there, and your eyes would try to fill in gaps with shapes that did not exist. A pile of debris might look like a crouching figure, or a distant flicker of light might appear closer than it actually was. At the same time, real dangers could go unnoticed until it was too late. This imbalance, imagining threats where there were none while missing those that were real, created a constant state of unease. It was mentally exhausting, and over time, that exhaustion could dull your reactions, making you slower to respond when something truly required your attention. There was also the growing pressure of isolation. Even in a town, the absence of visible people could make you feel completely alone. Windows were shuttered, doors were barred, and whatever life existed inside homes was hidden from view. You were cut off from the sense of community that defined medieval society during the day. This isolation was not just emotional, it had practical consequences. If you needed help, there was no easy way to signal for it without potentially alarming others or drawing unwanted attention. A cry for help might be ignored, misunderstood, or even seen as a trick to lure someone outside. Trust was fragile, and fear often overrode compassion in the darkness. If you tried to move quickly to escape these feelings, you risked making mistakes. Uneven ground, loose stones, and hidden obstacles could trip you, and a fall at night was far more dangerous than one during the day. Injuries that limited your mobility could leave you stranded, especially if you were far from any safe place. In such a situation, time became your enemy. You had to endure the remaining hours of darkness with limited options, hoping that nothing else would go wrong before morning arrived. Another factor that added to the tension was the unpredictability of other people's reactions. Even if you encountered someone who was not inherently dangerous, fear could drive them to act defensively or aggressively. A homeowner who heard movement outside might assume the worst and confront you with hostility. A passerby might interpret your presence as a threat and react before asking questions. In a world without reliable identification or communication, misunderstandings were common. And at night, they were more likely to escalate. You were not just managing your own fear. You were also navigating the fear of everyone else around you. For those who believed strongly in omens and signs, the night carried an additional layer of meaning. Unusual occurrences, an unexpected sound, an animal crossing your path, a sudden gust of wind, could be interpreted as warnings or messages. These interpretations influenced decisions, sometimes leading people to change direction, stop moving altogether, or take actions they would not consider during the day. Whether or not these beliefs had any basis in reality, they shaped behavior in ways that could either help or hinder survival. In some cases, acting on such instincts might keep you away from danger. In others, it might lead you straight into it. As the night wore on, physical discomfort often compounded the psychological strain. The ground retained cold, damp air settled into clothing, and fatigue made every movement feel heavier. If you had been active throughout the day, your body would naturally want rest, but finding a safe place to stop was not easy. Sitting or lying down in an exposed area made you vulnerable, yet continuing to move required energy you might not have. This tension between the need to rest and the need to stay alert created a difficult balance to maintain. And then there was the ever-present uncertainty of what you might become part of simply by being there. In a time when communication was limited and events were often understood through fragments of information, being in the wrong place at the wrong time could entangle you in situations beyond your control. You might unknowingly walk into the aftermath of a crime, encounter a patrol searching for suspects, or be present when something unexpected occurred. In such cases, your presence alone could be enough to draw suspicion or involvement, regardless of your intentions. When the first hints of dawn finally appeared, they did more than just bring light. They restored a sense of order to the world. The same streets that felt threatening at night became familiar again, and the same people who seemed distant or suspicious became part of a visible community once more. But the experience of being outside after dark would not simply fade away. It would leave behind a heightened awareness of how quickly circumstances could change, how fragile safety could be, and how much of daily life depended on conditions that were easy to take for granted. In the end, being caught outside after dark in medieval times was not defined by a single dramatic event, but by a continuous state of vulnerability. It was a test of awareness, endurance, and judgment. In an environment where certainty was scarce and risks were everywhere, Every step, every sound, and every decision carried weight. And survival often depended on how well you could navigate a world that operated by entirely different rules once the sun disappeared. And if the night pushed on toward its darkest hours, those moments just before dawn when fatigue was at its peak, and the world felt suspended between stillness and uncertainty, the experience could become almost surreal. Your mind, strained by hours of alertness, might begin to blur the line between reality and imagination. Thoughts drifted, focus slipped, and the ability to make clear, rational decisions weakened. In medieval times, without artificial light or stimulation, the body was naturally conditioned to rest during these hours. So forcing yourself to remain active meant working against your own instincts. This internal conflict between the need to stay vigilant and the body's demand for rest created a dangerous imbalance. At this stage, even your sense of identity and purpose could feel less certain. Why were you out here? What were you trying to reach? The urgency that may have driven you outside earlier could begin to fade, replaced by a simple desire to endure until morning. This shift in mindset could influence your actions in subtle ways. You might take risks you would normally avoid just to find shelter or relief, or you might become overly cautious, slowing your progress to a near standstill. Either extreme could be problematic, especially when time and energy were limited. The environment around you, too, seemed to change character as the night deepened. Air grew cooler and heavier, and the absence of movement in the streets created a kind of eerie stillness. Even the animals that had been active earlier in the night might quiet down, leaving stretches of near silence that felt unnatural. In such moments, any sudden noise, a door creaking open, a distant shout, the clatter of something falling, could feel amplified, sending a surge of adrenaline through your body. This constant fluctuation between silence and sudden sound kept your nerves on edge, making it difficult to relax even briefly. If you encountered another person during these late hours, the interaction could be even more unpredictable than earlier in the night. Both of you would likely be tired, cautious, and possibly frightened. Communication might be brief and tense, with each word chosen carefully. There was little room for misunderstanding, yet misunderstanding was more likely than ever. A simple question could be interpreted as an accusation, and a defensive response could escalate into conflict. In a world without quick ways to verify identity or intent, trust had to be established almost instantly or not at all. There was also a sense in which the night exposed the limits of human control over the environment. During the day, people shaped their surroundings through work, trade, and interaction. At night, those activities largely ceased, and the natural world reasserted itself. Darkness, weather, and the rhythms of nocturnal life took precedence, reminding anyone outside that they were operating in a space that was not fully theirs to command. This realization could be humbling, even unsettling, as it highlighted how dependent daily life was on conditions that could not be maintained around the clock. For those who managed to find temporary shelter, perhaps under an overhang in a doorway or within a partially enclosed space, the experience was not necessarily one of relief. Resting in such places came with its own risks. You had to remain alert enough to respond to any approaching danger, yet still try to conserve energy, sleep if it came at all, would be light and fragmented, easily broken by the smallest disturbance. And when you woke, there was often a moment of disorientation, a brief confusion about where you were and why, before the reality of your situation returned. As the horizon slowly began to lighten, the transition from night to day did not happen instantly but gradually. And even after everything, the fear, the uncertainty, the constant vigilance, there was still one final layer that made being outside after dark in medieval times so intense. The lasting imprint it left on your mind long after the night had ended. Surviving such an experience was not just about getting through those hours. It was about how those hours changed the way you saw the world afterward. Once you had felt that level of vulnerability, it was difficult to return to a sense of complete ease, even in daylight. The memory of how quickly safety could disappear lingered, shaping your instincts and behavior in subtle but powerful ways. In the days that followed, you might find yourself more cautious, more aware of your surroundings, more attentive to the position of the sun and the approach of evening. What had once been a routine transition from day to night now carried a deeper meaning. You understood, not just intellectually but experientially, that darkness was not neutral. It was transformative. It changed the rules, altered the balance of power, and exposed weaknesses that were otherwise easy to ignore. This awareness could be useful, even protective, but it also came with a certain weight. It meant that a part of you remained alert, even when there was no immediate threat. In a broader sense, these individual experiences contributed to the collective mindset of medieval society. The caution surrounding nighttime was not just based on abstract fears or superstitions. It was reinforced by real encounters, real dangers, and real consequences. Stories of what happened after dark were shared, repeated, and remembered, becoming part of the cultural fabric. These stories were not always exaggerated. They often reflected genuine risks that people had faced. As they spread, they shaped expectations, teaching others what to avoid and how to behave. Over time, this created a kind of shared understanding that the night was a boundary and crossing it without necessity was unwise. This collective caution influenced how towns and communities were organized. The emphasis on closing gates, enforcing curfews, and limiting nighttime movement was not just about control. It was about survival. People structured their lives around daylight because daylight offered visibility, predictability, and a greater sense of security. The night, by contrast, represented a gap in that structure, a period where control was reduced and risks increased. By minimizing exposure to that period, communities could reduce the chances of harm. Yet, despite all these precautions, the night could never be entirely avoided. Emergencies happened, responsibilities called, and circumstances sometimes forced people outside, regardless of the risks. It was in these moments that the true nature of the medieval night revealed itself, not as an abstract concept, but as a lived reality. Each person who ventured out carried their own story, their own reasons, and their own level of preparedness. Some returned without incident, their journey uneventful but still tense. Others faced challenges that tested their limits, leaving them changed in ways that were not always visible to others. There was also a quiet resilience in how people adapted to these conditions. Over time, individuals and communities developed ways to cope, to reduce risk, and to navigate the night when they had to. Knowledge was passed down about which routes were safer, which areas to avoid, how to interpret sounds, and how to recognize signs of danger. This knowledge did not eliminate the risks, but it made them more manageable. It turned the night from an unknown void into something that, while still dangerous, could be understood to a degree. Even so, there was always an element that remained beyond control. No amount of preparation could account for every possibility: the unpredictability of human behavior, the suddenness of environmental changes, and the limitations of perception ensured that the night retained its edge. It was this unpredictability that kept the sense of danger alive, preventing the night from ever becoming truly routine. And perhaps that is what defined the experience most of all, not just the specific threats, but the constant awareness that anything could happen, and that you had limited means to respond if it did. This awareness shaped every movement, every decision, every moment of stillness. It was a kind of tension that did not fully release until the first light of day, when the world gradually returned to a state that felt more stable and understandable. So when we imagine being caught outside after dark in medieval times, it is not just a single scenario we are picturing, but an entire shift in reality. It is stepping into a space where the familiar becomes uncertain, where safety is no longer assumed, and where survival depends on a delicate balance of caution, awareness, and endurance. It is an experience that unfolds slowly, layer by layer, revealing not only the dangers of the environment, but also the limits of human control within it. And when it ends, when the sun rises and the structures of daily life reassemble around you, you are left with more than just relief. You carry with you a deeper understanding of the world you live in, one that includes not only its visible, orderly side, but also the hidden, uncertain dimension that emerges when darkness falls. That understanding, once gained, does not easily fade. It becomes part of how you see, how you think, and how you move through both day and night. A quiet reminder of a time when every shadow held a question, and every step forward required a measure of courage. And even beyond all of that, there was a deeper, almost existential layer to being outside after dark in medieval times. A quiet realization that you were, for those hours, removed from the protections of society and placed directly into a world that did not bend itself to human needs. During the day, life was structured by systems, markets, laws, social interactions, visible authority. But at night, those systems thinned out, and what remained was something far more raw. You were no longer just a member of a community. You were an individual exposed to forces that cared nothing for your plans, your status, or your intentions. In that exposure, time itself seemed to stretch and compress unpredictably. Moments of fear could feel endless, while stretches of uneventful walking might pass in a blur. This distortion made it difficult to maintain a steady rhythm of thought. You might find yourself replaying the same concerns again and again. Where to go? Who might be nearby? How long until daylight, without arriving at any new answers? This mental looping could trap you in a kind of internal echo, where your own thoughts became as oppressive as the darkness around you. Your relationship with space also shifted in subtle but powerful ways. Distances felt longer, obstacles seemed larger, and the environment appeared less stable. A doorway that would normally offer shelter might now feel like a confined space where you could be cornered. An open street, which during the day provided freedom of movement, might feel exposed and unsafe. Every option carried both potential safety and potential risk, and choosing between them required quick judgment based on incomplete information. There was no perfect choice, only the least dangerous one. If you paused to rest your mind, even briefly, the stillness could become overwhelming. Without constant movement or decision making, your awareness might turn inward, amplifying every sensation. The sound of your own breathing, the beat of your heart, the subtle movements of your body, all became more noticeable, almost intrusive. This heightened self-awareness could make you feel more present, but also more vulnerable, as if you were acutely aware of your own fragility in an environment that offered little protection. There was also a strange tension between hope and uncertainty as the night progressed. You knew that morning would come, but you did not know what would happen before it did. That gap between certainty and unpredictability defined the experience. You were moving towards something guaranteed, daylight, but the path to reach it was filled with variables you could not fully control. This created a kind of suspended state where you were neither safe nor entirely lost, but somewhere in between. In some cases, being outside after dark could force you to rely on instincts you rarely used during the day. Subtle cues, changes in air movement, faint sounds, the texture of the ground beneath your feet, became important sources of information. You might find yourself paying attention to details you would normally ignore, building a mental map based not on clear visuals, but on fragments of sensory input. This kind of awareness could be surprisingly effective, but it required energy and focus that were difficult to sustain over long periods. Encounters with the built environment, walls, gates, doorways, also took on new meaning. These structures, designed to organize and protect during the day, could become barriers at night. A closed gate might block your path entirely, forcing you to reroute through less familiar or more dangerous areas. High walls could trap you in narrow passages with limited exits. Even something as simple as a locked door could represent both safety and exclusion, depending on which side of it you were on. The very features that made medieval towns secure could also make them difficult to navigate when access was restricted. And then there was the quiet awareness that in many ways you were witnessing a version of the world that most people deliberately avoided. The night revealed patterns and behaviors that were hidden during the day, not just in terms of danger, but in how the environment itself functioned when left largely undisturbed. You might notice how sound carried differently, and if you continue to stretch that experience even further, there comes a point where the night begins to feel less like a temporary condition and more like a world in itself, one with its own logic, its own pace, and its own quiet rules that you are forced to learn in real time. By then, you are no longer reacting to each individual sound or shadow with sharp bursts of fear. Instead, you exist in a sustained state of alertness, where your awareness spreads out in all directions. You begin to anticipate rather than simply respond. Every step is placed with intention, every pause calculated, every movement measured against the possibility of consequence. It is not panic anymore, it is endurance. At this stage, your mind starts to simplify things. Complex thoughts give way to basic priorities. Keep moving, stay aware, avoid risk, reach safety. The broader concerns of your life ambitions, worries about the future, social expectations fade into the background. What remains is a narrow focus on the present moment. In a strange way, this can bring a kind of clarity. You are no longer distracted. You are entirely engaged with your surroundings. But that clarity comes at a cost because it is sustained by tension. You cannot relax without risking awareness, and you cannot maintain that level of awareness indefinitely without becoming exhausted. Your relationship with fear also changes. Early in the night, fear is sharp and immediate, triggered by specific stimuli. Later, it becomes quieter, but more constant. A background presence that shapes your decisions even when nothing is actively happening. You no longer need a visible threat to feel its influence. It is enough to know that the conditions for danger exist. This kind of fear is harder to shake because it does not peak and subside. It lingers, influencing your judgment in subtle ways. You might avoid certain paths not because you have seen danger there, but because they feel wrong. You might choose longer routes, simply because they offer slightly more visibility or familiarity. There is also a growing awareness of how exposed you truly are. During the day, being seen is normal. It is part of how society functions. At night, visibility becomes a double-edged concept. Being seen could mean help, but it could also mean danger. Remaining unseen might protect you, but it also isolates you further. You are constantly negotiating this balance, adjusting your movement and behavior based on incomplete information. This negotiation becomes almost instinctive over time, but it never fully loses its tension. As your body continues to tire, small inefficiencies begin to appear. Your steps may become less steady, your reactions slightly slower, your decisions a bit less precise. You might not notice these changes immediately, but they accumulate. A delayed reaction here, a misjudged distance there. Each one increases your vulnerability. In a setting where even minor mistakes can have serious consequences, this gradual decline in performance is a significant risk. It is not a sudden failure, but a slow erosion of effectiveness. And yet, alongside all of this, there is a quiet resilience that emerges. Humans are remarkably adaptable, and even in such conditions you begin to find ways to cope. You learn to interpret the environment more efficiently, to conserve energy where possible, to manage your fear so that it informs rather than overwhelms you. These adaptations do not eliminate the danger, but they allow you to function within it. You become, in a sense, part of the night. Not in control of it, but capable of moving through it with a degree of competence. There are moments, too, when the intensity briefly softens. A patch of clearer moonlight, a familiar landmark. The distant sound of early activity signaling that dawn is approaching. These small signs can provide a sense of direction and hope. They remind you that the night is not endless, that there is an end point you are moving toward. These moments are important, not because they remove the danger, but because they help sustain your focus and determination. When the first true signs of morning begin to appear, not just a faint light, but the gradual return of colour, detail and movement, the shift feels profound. It is not just that you can see better. It is that the entire framework of the world seems to reassemble around you. The uncertainty that dominated the night begins to recede, replaced by patterns you recognize and understand. People emerge, activity resumes, and the invisible network of social order becomes visible again. But by then, you are not quite the same as you were before the night began. You carry with you an awareness that is difficult to fully articulate, a sense of how thin the boundary is between order and uncertainty, between safety and exposure. You have experienced what it is like to exist outside the usual structures, to rely on your own perception and judgment in a setting where both can be challenged. That experience does not fade quickly. It becomes part of how you interpret the world, even when conditions are normal again. So being caught outside after dark in medieval times was not just a matter of facing external dangers. It was a process that unfolded within you as much as around you. It reshaped your attention, your priorities, your sense of control. It forced you to confront the limits of what you could rely on, and to adapt in ways that were not always comfortable, but were necessary for survival. And when it finally ended, when daylight returned and the world settled back into its familiar patterns, you were left with more than relief. You were left with the memory of having moved through a version of reality where every moment required awareness, where every decision mattered, and where simply making it through the night was, in itself, an achievement. And if you imagine that experience continuing even further, what begins to stand out is how the night slowly strips life down to its most essential elements. By that point, you are no longer thinking in terms of plans or destinations in the way you would during the day. The idea of where you are going becomes secondary to the more immediate question of how you will keep going. Every step becomes its own decision, independent and important. The larger journey dissolves into a sequence of small, careful choices, each one shaped by what little information you can gather from your surroundings. Your awareness of your own limits becomes sharper. You start to recognize exactly how far your body can go before it begins to falter, how long you can maintain focus before your thoughts begin to drift, how much uncertainty you can tolerate before it starts to affect your judgment. These limits are not theoretical. They are felt directly moment by moment. And because there are no easy ways to recover or reset in that environment, you are constantly balancing how much energy to use and how much to conserve. Even something as simple as choosing when to pause and when to move becomes a critical decision. There is also a subtle shift in how you perceive risk. Early on, you might think of danger as something sudden and dramatic, an attack, an encounter, a mistake. But as time passes, you begin to understand that risk is often cumulative. It builds quietly, through fatigue, through small errors, through moments of inattention. Nothing may go wrong all at once, but the longer you remain exposed, the more those small factors add up. This realization changes how you behave. You become more deliberate, more measured, less willing to take unnecessary chances, even if they might save time at the same time. Your connection to the environment becomes more immediate and less abstract. You are not just moving through space, you are responding to it in real time. The texture of the ground, the angle of a wall, the direction of a breeze. These details take on greater importance because they provide clues about where you are and what might lie ahead. You begin to read the environment in a way that is almost instinctive. piecing together fragments of information. It is not perfect, but it is enough to guide your next step. There is also a growing awareness of how fragile your sense of control really is. During the day, control often feels natural and constant. You decide where to go, what to do, how to act. At night, that control feels conditional. It depends on factors you cannot fully influence: light, visibility, the actions of others, the unpredictability of the environment. This does not mean you are powerless, but it does mean that your control is limited and must be used carefully. You cannot force the situation to bend to your will. You can only adapt to it as it unfolds. In that adaptation, a kind of quiet discipline emerges. You learn to regulate your movements, your reactions, even your thoughts. You avoid sudden actions unless necessary. You listen more than you speak. You observe more than you assume. This discipline is not something you consciously decide to adopt. It develops naturally as a response to the conditions around you. It becomes a way of maintaining balance in a setting where imbalance can have serious consequences. And yet, even with all this adaptation, there remains an underlying uncertainty that never fully disappears. No matter how careful you are, how aware, how disciplined, there are always elements beyond your perception. Something could still happen that you did not anticipate. A situation could still arise that you are not prepared for. This awareness keeps you alert, but it also reminds you that complete safety is not something you can achieve in that moment. You are not eliminating risk. You are managing it. As the night begins, very gradually to give way to morning, this long period of tension starts to loosen. It does not vanish instantly. Instead, it recedes step by step. And if you keep extending that experience to its fullest depth, what finally emerges is a quiet understanding that the night was not just something happening around you. It was something you had to continuously negotiate with. It was not an enemy in the simple sense, but it was not neutral either. It constantly tested your awareness, your patience, and your ability to remain composed under uncertainty. Every moment outside after dark became a kind of silent exchange between you and your surroundings. You observed, adjusted, reacted, and the environment responded in its own unpredictable ways. By this stage, your thinking becomes almost entirely instinct-driven. Not because you have lost the ability to reason, but because reasoning in the usual sense becomes too slow and uncertain. You begin to trust patterns instead of explanations, familiar shapes, consistent sounds, known routes. If something feels wrong, even without clear evidence, you act on that feeling. This reliance on instinct is not irrational. It is a form of efficiency, a way to make decisions quickly, when time and clarity are limited, but it also means that your experience becomes more intuitive and less analytical, shaped by impressions rather than certainties. There is also a subtle shift in how you perceive safety itself. During the day, safety often feels like a stable condition. You are either safe or you are not. At night, safety becomes temporary and relative. You might feel safe in one spot for a few moments, only to realize that the same spot could become dangerous if circumstances change. There is no permanent refuge outside, only brief pockets of reduced risk. This forces you to keep moving, or at least to remain ready to move at any time. Stillness becomes a calculated pause rather than a true rest. Your awareness of other people becomes sharper, even when you cannot see them. You begin to sense presence through indirect cues, the faint echo of footsteps, the way sound shifts in a confined space, the subtle indication that you are not alone. These cues are often ambiguous, but you learn to interpret them as best as you can, because ignoring them could be costly. At the same time, you become aware that others might be sensing you in the same way. This creates a kind of silent interaction, where both sides are aware of each other without direct contact, each deciding how to act based on limited information. As your body continues to endure the strain, you also become more conscious of efficiency in your movements. You waste less energy, avoid unnecessary detours, and choose actions that balance speed with safety. Even the way you step, the way you turn, the way you pause becomes more deliberate. It is not just about reaching a destination anymore. It is about maintaining a steady, sustainable pace that keeps you functional until conditions improve. There is, however, an ever-present awareness that no matter how well you adapt, you are still operating within limits. You cannot see everything, you cannot predict everything, and you cannot control everything. This realization does not necessarily create fear at this stage. It creates humility. You understand that survival is not entirely in your hands, that chance plays a role, and that sometimes the best you can do is reduce risk rather than eliminate it. And then, almost without you noticing at first, the balance begins to shift. The darkness that once dominated your perception starts to lose its hold. Edges sharpen, shapes separate, distances become measurable again. The environment, which felt uncertain and fluid, begins to stabilize. With this change, your reliance on instinct slowly gives way to clearer reasoning. Decisions that once required careful intuition now feel straightforward. Paths that seemed risky become manageable. The world regains its structure, but the most lasting part of the experience is not the danger itself. It is the contrast. Having spent hours in a state where every detail mattered, where every action required awareness, you come to recognize how much of daily life depends on conditions you rarely think about. Light, visibility, shared presence, predictable behavior. These are not just conveniences. They are the foundation of how people function together. So being caught outside after dark in medieval times was in its deepest sense an immersion into a different version of reality, one where those foundations were weakened or absent. It was a prolonged negotiation with uncertainty, a test of how well you could adapt when the usual structures fell away. And when it ended, when daylight returned, and the familiar world reassembled around you, you did not simply go back to normal. You carried with you an expanded awareness of risk, of perception, of the fragile balance that makes ordinary life feel safe. In that way, the experience was not just about enduring the night. It was about understanding it, learning how it reshaped everything you thought you knew about your surroundings, your decisions, and yourself. And that understanding, once gained, stayed with you, quietly influencing how you moved through both darkness and light for the rest of your life. And if you continue to follow that experience all the way to its deepest point, what becomes most striking is how completely the night reshapes your sense of reality itself. By now, it is no longer just about danger or caution. It is about existing in a state where certainty is almost entirely absent. You are no longer expecting things to make sense in the way they do during the day. Instead, you accept that every piece of information you receive, every sound, every shadow, every faint outline, is partial, incomplete, and open to interpretation. At this stage, your mind adapts by becoming more flexible, but also more guarded. You stop assuming that what you perceive is fully accurate. You begin to treat everything as a possibility rather than a fact. That shape ahead could be a person, or it could be an object. That sound could be movement, or it could be the environment shifting. This constant evaluation slows you down, but it also keeps you from making reckless decisions. You move carefully, not because you are certain of danger, but because you are aware of how little you can truly confirm. There is also a growing sense that you are moving through layers rather than a single space. The visible world, the ground beneath your feet, the walls around you, is only one layer. Beyond it lies another layer made up of things you cannot fully see or understand. Hidden movement, unseen observers, unknown conditions. You are navigating both at once, even though you only have clear access to one. This dual awareness creates a kind of mental tension, as you are constantly accounting for what might exist beyond your perception. Your emotional state, too, becomes more controlled, almost subdued. The sharp spikes of fear from earlier in the night give way to something steadier, more contained. You cannot afford to react strongly to every uncertainty. It would exhaust you too quickly. Instead, you maintain a baseline level of caution, adjusting only when something clearly demands your attention. This emotional regulation is not calm in the usual sense. It is a form of endurance, a way of sustaining yourself through prolonged uncertainty. At the same time, your sense of self becomes more focused and immediate. You are not thinking about how you appear to others, or what others might think of you. Those concerns belong to a world that feels distant in the darkness. What matters now is your ability to perceive, to decide, to act. Your identity narrows to those functions. You become, in a way, defined by your awareness, by how well you can interpret the limited information available to you and respond appropriately. There is also an increasing awareness of how interconnected everything is. A single decision, choosing one path over another, deciding to move faster or slower, can influence everything that follows. There are no isolated actions. Each one feeds into the next, shaping your overall situation. This makes even small choices feel significant, not because they are dramatic on their own, but because of how they accumulate over time. As your body continues to push through fatigue, you may notice moments where your perception sharpens unexpectedly. Perhaps a sound becomes clearer, or a shape more distinct, as if your mind is compensating for the lack of light by focusing more intensely on what little information is available. These moments can be helpful, giving you brief clarity in an otherwise uncertain environment. But they are not constant, and relying on them too much can lead to overconfidence. Balance remains essential. Using these moments without assuming they will always be there. And then gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, the balance begins to shift again. The darkness, which once felt dominant and overwhelming, starts to recede. It does not disappear suddenly, it loosens its hold. The layers of uncertainty begin to thin. What was once ambiguous becomes more defined. The dual awareness of what you can see and what you cannot starts to collapse back into a single, clearer view of the world. With that change, your mind begins to expand again. The narrow focus that sustained you through the night relaxes, allowing broader thoughts to return. You start to think not just about the next step, but about where you are going, what you will do next, how the experience has affected you. The tension that defined your actions begins to release, replaced by a quieter, more stable awareness. But what remains, even as the world returns to normal, is the understanding of how different things can be when the usual conditions are removed. You have experienced a version of reality where clarity was limited, where trust was uncertain, where control was partial at best, and that experience does not simply fade. And if you follow that experience all the way to its quiet conclusion, what ultimately becomes clear is that the night was not just something you passed through. It was something that, for a time, redefined the relationship between you and everything around you. By the end of it, you are no longer reacting to each moment in isolation. Instead, you begin to perceive the entire experience as a continuous flow, where each second connects to the next, forming an unbroken chain of awareness, movement, and adjustment. At this point, your actions are no longer driven by urgency or even fear in the usual sense, but by a kind of steady acceptance. You understand the conditions you are in, you recognize the limits of what you can control, and you operate within those limits as effectively as you can. There is no resistance left in your thinking, no frustration about the darkness, no wish for things to be different. That kind of thinking has already been worn down by time and necessity. What remains is a focused engagement with reality as it is, not as you would prefer it to be. Your perception of the environment also becomes more unified. Earlier, the night felt fragmented, separate sounds, isolated shadows, disconnected impressions. Now those fragments begin to merge into a more coherent whole. You start to recognize patterns in the way the environment behaves, how sound travels through certain spaces, how light shifts depending on the angle of the sky, how different areas carry different levels of risk. This does not make the night predictable, but it makes it more navigable. You are no longer just reacting, you are understanding. Even if that understanding remains incomplete, there is also a sense in which your awareness extends beyond immediate survival. You begin to notice the rhythm of the night itself, not just its dangers, but its structure. The way activity rises and falls, the way certain sounds appear and disappear, the way the environment subtly changes as time moves forward. This awareness gives you a broader context for your actions. You are not just moving through space. You are moving through a process that has its own progression, its own stages. At the same time, your sense of vulnerability does not disappear. It simply becomes integrated into your awareness. You no longer experience it as something separate or alarming. It is just part of the situation, something you account for without needing to focus on it constantly. This integration is what allows you to function more steadily, even after hours of uncertainty. You are not free from risk, but you are no longer overwhelmed by it either. As your body continues to carry you forward, there is a quiet recognition of effort, not in a dramatic or emotional way, but as a simple acknowledgement that you have been sustaining yourself through something demanding. Each step is not just movement, it is continuation. Each moment of awareness is not just perception, it is maintenance of balance in an environment that does not offer it easily. And then, as the final transition begins, the change feels almost gentle. The first real presence of daylight does not arrive as a sudden shift, but as a gradual restoration. The uncertainty that defined the night does not vanish instantly. It dissolves, layer by layer. Shadows retreat, distances clarify, and the need for constant interpretation begins to fade. The world becomes readable again. With that readability comes a return of ease, not complete, but noticeable. You can move without analyzing every step, observe without questioning every detail, exist without maintaining constant alertness. The effort that defined the night begins to release, and with it, the intensity of the experience. But what stays with you is not just the memory of difficulty. It is the understanding of how much of your experience depends on conditions that are often invisible when they are present. Light, structure, shared activity, predictable behavior. These are not just conveniences. They are what make the world feel stable. When they are removed, even temporarily, everything shifts. So being caught outside after dark in medieval times was at its deepest level an encounter with that shift. It was a prolonged immersion in a version of reality where stability had to be created moment by moment, where awareness replaced assumption, and where survival depended on your ability to adapt continuously to changing conditions. And when it ended, when the light returned, and the familiar world reassembled, you did not simply step back into your old life unchanged. You carried with you a refined awareness, a quieter understanding of how fragile and conditional that sense of normalcy really was. You understood that what felt solid and dependable during the day was, in part, a product of circumstances that could just as easily disappear. In that sense, the night was not just something to endure or escape. It was something that revealed the deeper structure of the world you lived in, showing you both its stability and its vulnerability, its order and its uncertainty. And for anyone who experienced it fully, it left behind not just a memory, but a lasting shift in how they perceived every step they took, whether in darkness or in light. And if you continue to unfold that experience to its very last layer, what remains is not fear, not even tension, but a kind of quiet awareness that feels almost detached from everything else. By now, the night is no longer something you are trying to get through. It is something you have learned to exist within. The urgency that marked the earlier hours has dissolved, and in its place is a steady, almost rhythmic engagement with your surroundings. You are not rushing, not hesitating, you are simply continuing. At this point, your mind and body begin to move in a kind of alignment that only comes from prolonged exposure to uncertainty. Your actions require less conscious effort. They flow more naturally, shaped by everything you have already adapted to. You are no longer actively thinking about every decision, yet you are not careless either. It is a balanced state, where awareness and movement coexist without friction. In a strange way, this is the most stable you have felt all night. Not because the environment has become safer, but because you have adjusted to its instability. Your perception of time also changes once more. Earlier, time felt stretched. heavy, almost immovable. Now, it begins to feel lighter, less oppressive. You are no longer counting moments or waiting for them to pass. Instead, time becomes something that moves with you, not against you. This shift does not mean the night has ended. It means you have reached a point where you are no longer defined by it in the same way. There is also a subtle clarity that emerges about the nature of control. You understand now, not as an idea but as a lived reality, that control is never absolute. Even during the day, it is only partial. It just feels complete, because conditions support it. The night strips away that illusion and shows you what remains when those supports are gone. And what remains is not helplessness, but adaptability, the ability to adjust, to respond, to continue. Despite not having full control, that is what carries you through. As you move through these final stretches before dawn, the environment begins to feel less like something separate from you and more like something you are part of. Not in a mystical sense, but in a practical one. Your actions are shaped by it, and in turn, your presence becomes part of it. You are no longer trying to impose your will on the situation. You are working within it, aligning with its patterns as much as possible. There are moments, brief but noticeable, where the weight of the experience seems to lift just slightly. Not enough to remove the awareness of risk, but enough to create a sense of space in your thinking. You might notice the sky changing tone, or the outlines of buildings becoming softer, or the air shifting in a way that signals the approach of morning. These moments do not end the night, but they mark its transformation. They are small signs that the conditions you have been adapting to are beginning to change. And when the transition finally completes, when light becomes strong enough to fully define the world around you, the shift feels almost quiet. There is no dramatic break, no sudden release. Instead, it is as if the world gently reclaims its structure. The uncertainties that once required constant attention simply fade into the background, no longer demanding the same level of focus. In that return, you do not immediately revert to how you were before. There is a brief period where both states seem to overlap. The heightened awareness of the night and the clarity of the day existing together. You see more, notice more, move with a little more intention than usual. But gradually, as normal activity resumes, that heightened state begins to settle, integrating into your overall understanding rather than standing apart from it. What you are left with is not just the memory of a difficult night, but a deeper familiarity with the boundaries of your own perception and control. You have experienced what it is like to function without the usual supports, to rely on awareness and adaptability rather than certainty. And that experience does not disappear. It becomes part of how you interpret the world moving forward. So in the very end, being caught outside after dark in medieval times was not just about danger or fear or endurance. It was about transition, moving from a world of structure into a world of uncertainty, and then back again. It was about discovering how much of what feels stable is actually conditional, and how you respond when those conditions are removed. And when you step fully back into the light, into the familiar rhythms of daytime life, and if you follow the experience to its absolute end, what remains is something almost paradoxical. After everything the night demanded from you, your attention, your caution, your endurance. You arrive at a kind of still understanding that is quieter than fear and deeper than relief. It is the realization that the night did not just challenge you. It revealed the framework beneath everything you take for granted. By now, you are no longer thinking in terms of, what if something happens? That phase has passed. Instead, you exist in a state where possibilities are always present, but no longer overwhelming. You have already moved through uncertainty for so long that it has become familiar, not comfortable, but recognizable. And in that recognition, there is a kind of calm that is very different from the safety of daylight. It is not based on protection, it is based on adaptation. Your awareness becomes less about scanning for threats and more about maintaining balance. You are not reacting as much as you are sustaining, keeping your movement steady, your perception open, your thoughts clear enough to function. It is a quieter form of focus, one that does not spike or crash, but holds itself evenly over time. This is perhaps the most refined state you reach during the night. Not driven by urgency, not clouded by fear, but guided by a steady, continuous awareness. At the same time, your sense of distance, from both danger and safety, changes. You no longer feel close to either. Safety is not something you expect immediately, and danger is not something you assume is imminent. Both exist as possibilities, and you move between them without fully attaching to either one. This detachment is not indifference. It is a way of conserving mental energy, of avoiding extremes that could disrupt your ability to continue. There is also a deeper understanding of how little you actually need to keep going. During the day, life is filled with layers, goals, distractions, social interactions, expectations. At night, all of that falls away. What remains is very simple: awareness, movement, and the will to continue. And in that simplicity, you discover that much of what feels necessary in ordinary life is not essential in moments of survival. This realization does not diminish those things, but it changes how you see them. As the final traces of darkness begin to dissolve, the transition into daylight feels less like an escape and more like a re-entry. You are not leaving something behind entirely. You are bringing something back with you. The awareness you developed, the discipline you maintained, the understanding you gained, they do not vanish with the darkness. They integrate into your perception of the world. The light does not just reveal your surroundings, it reveals how different your relationship to them has become. You notice details you might have ignored before. You appreciate the clarity, not as something ordinary, but as something that was temporarily lost and regained. Even the presence of other people feels different, not just familiar, but stabilizing in a way that is now more deeply understood. And yet, as normal life resumes, there is a gradual softening. The heightened awareness begins to ease, the constant calculation fades, and your mind expands again to include the broader concerns of daily life. But it does not return to exactly where it was. There is a subtle shift, a quiet layer of understanding that remains beneath everything else. So in its fullest sense, being caught outside after dark in medieval times was not just an experience of danger or endurance. It was a process of reduction and reconstruction. The night stripped away assumptions, tested your limits, and forced you to rely on the most fundamental aspects of perception and decision-making. And in doing so, it showed you what remains when everything else is uncertain. When it ended, you did not simply feel relief. You felt a kind of completion, not because the night was something to conquer, but because you had moved through it, adapted to it, and come out the other side with a deeper understanding of both the world and yourself. And that is what truly defined those nights. Not just the darkness, not just the risks, but the way they revealed the fragile, conditional nature of order and the quiet, resilient capacity within you to navigate what lies beyond it. And if you continue even beyond that final layer, what remains is not a new event or a new danger, but a kind of lingering clarity, an afterimage of the night that stays with you, even as everything returns to normal. It is subtle, almost difficult to describe, but it changes how you interpret the world in ways that are not immediately obvious. You begin to realize that what made the night so powerful was not just what it contained, but what it removed. It removed certainty, removed visibility, removed the constant presence of others, removed the systems that quietly organize life during the day. And in removing those things, it exposed something deeper. How much of what you rely on is built on conditions rather than guarantees. This realization does not make the daylight feel less safe, but it makes that safety feel more intentional. You see structure where you once saw routine. You notice how people move in predictable ways, how spaces are designed to be navigable, how interactions are shaped by visibility and shared awareness. These things were always there, but now they stand out because you have experienced what it is like when they are absent. At the same time, there is a quiet shift in how you understand uncertainty. Before, uncertainty might have felt like something to avoid, something disruptive. After moving through the night, it becomes something you recognize as part of the world's underlying nature, not constant, not always visible, but always present at some level. And instead of resisting it, you understand that it can be navigated, that it does not automatically lead to failure or danger if approached with awareness. Your memory of the night does not replay as a single sequence, but as a collection of impressions, moments of stillness, fragments of sound. Decisions made without full information, the gradual return of light. These impressions do not fade completely. They settle into the background of your experience, influencing how you respond to similar situations in the future. You might not consciously think about them, but they shape your instincts, your caution, your sense of timing. There is also a subtle respect that develops, not just for the night itself, but for the conditions that allow life to function smoothly. Light, presence, structure. These are no longer invisible supports. They are recognized as active elements that make navigation, trust, and interaction possible. Without them, everything becomes more difficult, more uncertain, more dependent on individual awareness. And perhaps most importantly, there is a quiet confidence that emerges. Not the kind that comes from certainty, but the kind that comes from having moved through uncertainty and continued anyway. You know at some level that if conditions were to change again, if you were once more placed in a situation where clarity was limited and control was partial, you would not be starting from nothing. You would carry with you the experience of adaptation, the ability to function without relying entirely on stability. So in the end, Being caught outside after dark in medieval times was not just a temporary ordeal. It was an encounter with a different layer of reality, one that exists beneath the structured, visible world of everyday life. It revealed how quickly that structure could shift, how much of it depended on conditions that could not always be maintained, and how individuals responded when those conditions were removed. And when it was over, what stayed was not just the memory of danger, but the understanding of balance, the balance between light and darkness, certainty and uncertainty, control and adaptation. It was an experience that quietly reshaped perception, leaving behind a deeper awareness of how the world functions and how you move within it. In that sense, the night did not end when the sun rose. It continued, in a quieter form, as part of how you saw, how you decided, and how you understood the fragile but resilient structure of life itself. And if you stretch the experience to its final, quiet echo, what remains is not something dramatic, but something almost philosophical, a realization that the night was never just a period of darkness, but a condition that revealed how dependent human life is on fragile layers of order. By the time you are fully back in the light, you understand that what you experienced was not an exception to reality, but another version of it, one that exists whenever structure weakens and certainty fades. You begin to see that medieval life itself was built around avoiding that version of reality as much as possible. The rules, the curfews, the closing of gates, the retreat indoors, all of it was not just about discipline or control, but about maintaining a boundary between two very different states of existence. Inside that boundary, life could be organized, predictable, shared. Outside it, especially at night, life became individual, uncertain, and exposed. And in moving through that exposed state, you have learned something that cannot be easily unlearned, that stability is something maintained, not something guaranteed. It depends on conditions aligning light, visibility, presence, cooperation. When those conditions weaken, even slightly, the world begins to behave differently. Not chaotically, but less predictably, less forgiving. There is also a quiet shift in how you understand effort. During the night, every small action required attention. Walking, listening, deciding, all of it demanded energy.